Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for July 16th, 2024, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody. Brendan, if you were going to be a solo act, what flower would you name yourself after?
Oh, sunflower. I'm a sunflower.
Sunflower?
Well, it's my wife's
Yeah.
favorite flower, so I feel like I have to
Okay.
pick that one.
Brendan the Sunflower. I love it. I'm just going to
Uh,
refer to Brendan as Sunflower for the rest of this episode.
As someone that also admittedly listens to some death metal, I feel like that's too delicate of a name now.
I'll just go, Sunflower.
Just add those growls.
Exactly.
Get those pig squeals in there. I feel like I'll be singing for a band like Opeth in the future.
Exactly. That's just how we'll have to do it for this episode. I am looking forward to having this conversation. In many ways, I feel like you should be the one leading the charge here with this review, as it is music oriented, and you're the music guy of the two of us. Normally, for those at least watching us on YouTube, you would know that because all of his music equipment is behind him. It isn't at the current moment,
No,
but it
I feel
normally
like
is.
I feel like I missed the memo on that one. Admittedly, I do have a dehumidifier going in this room, so I wanted to take my bass guitars out of the room just for space, and with that thing running, I didn't want my instruments in the way. But I'm wearing a shirt that's music related in some
There
way.
you go.
It's Salvage Station. It's actually a really cool venue in Asheville, North Carolina, that my wife and I went to when we visited. It's a really awesome venue, and I feel like stylistically, it's a place that was kind of in keeping to kind of the scene that is represented here in Dandelion and South Dakota specifically.
Yeah.
So I feel like I at least tried to find some
you go.
connectivity. I could have done better, though, admittedly.
No, that's perfectly fine. As we get into the conversation, it will become very evident that Brendan is certainly the music genius between the two of us. So I
Genius.
very much
Wow, I don't know
look
about
forward to
that. I just
getting...
like music.
I will say I have no idea where this conversation is going to go. I don't know how Brendan feels about Dandelion, but I will say this. Some of Brendan and I's either best, or at the very least for me, our most memorable conversations over the years have been around these music oriented films, especially with some sort of romance at the core. We've had quite a few of them. I'm sure we'll invoke some of those titles as we talk about the movie.
Oh,
but
yeah. It's sort of part of my opening thoughts, so we'll get there.
same.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much same. And I remember vividly having conversations, reviews about those films here on the show.
Oh,
You
yeah,
know,
same.
We always have a good time talking about these kinds of movies. So I do look forward to getting into Dandelion. Let's go ahead and jump into this. It is written and directed by Nicole Riegel, and it stars KiKi Layne, Thomas Doherty. That's mostly the central dynamic we're going to focus on here.
Yeah.
Although Melanie Nichols King does have a little bit of a presence in this film.
Yeah, kind of
playing
bookends
Jean,
the
who
film
is
mostly, I'd
Dandelion's
say. Yeah.
mother here.
Yeah.
Yes. If you're not familiar with Dandelion, it follows a singer, songwriter in a downward spiral as she takes a last effort gig at a motorcycle rally in South Dakota where she meets Casey, a guitarist who walked away from his dream long ago. All right, let's go ahead and dive into this. Brendan, what did you think about Dandelion?
Well, a few things up front. This did premiere. I don't know if it premiered, but I know it played at South by Southwest in March.
Yes, premiere.
And
This says it had
so,
its world premiere at South by on March 10th.
so it did premiere there, and we're finally getting it. And it's one that you and I actually didn't have on our schedule originally until we saw that we were actually getting it in some theaters nearby, and thought, maybe if it's something that we really like, it might be a good time to, I don't want to say promote it. We're not working for the film, obviously. But if there's something to be seen here that we think is worth
Mhm.
seeing, we wanted to at least time it in that way. And I do think the film is very much worth seeing. I really did enjoy it. And those movies that you talked about, JD, that we might be invoking, most of them are probably made by none other than John Carney, I think is who you're
Mhm.
probably referring to.
Mhm.
There's
Mhm.
a movie like this is going to draw many comparisons to Once, maybe Sing Street, but most importantly, something like Once. This definitely
Yeah.
follows the narrative framework of John Carney's 2008 film with Glenn Hansard and Marketa Irglova. Just the setting is very different. The tone of music is very different. The genres are a little bit different. This definitely explores a little bit more of the South Dakota country scene, as well as, KiKi Layne's character of Dandelion, as she calls herself, is more invoking this Southern folk soul kind of vibe. So it feels very more Americana. So the setting's very different. But narratively, it is very similar to some of these films that we've seen in the past. And the reason why it worked for me is it gets into something that's a little bit tonally different than some of these other films that it could easily be compared to. I think what this one does really interestingly is that it focuses more on the struggle of how to actually make it in this scene. This, I think, by comparison, is one of the least pleasant movies of its kind, even though there is an arguable, hopeful note in the way that it concludes. But we can certainly talk. We can certainly talk a little bit more about how that only relates to one of these two characters. But I think this movie gets into this really interesting idea that most musicians who are trying to make it in some way do struggle with. And that is that balance between reality and, I don't want to say fantasy, but
The
how that can be blurred.
dream.
The dream, absolutely. And where do you find that middle ground, if that middle ground even exists? And if you do find that middle ground, is that then seen as a betrayal to maybe your fellow past bandmates, as we might talk about with the
Mhm.
Casey character? I think those are really interesting ideas. I don't think this film is as strong as something like Once or even Sing Street. I think where those films mostly succeeded is in their musicality, if anything else, and maybe in their central relationships. I think those movies are just stronger. Although I do like the songs here in Dandelion, mostly all supervised by the Desner brothers, who have been very well known in the music and movie space, whether it be movies like Cyrano or even their band, The National, also working with Taylor
Mhm.
Swift. So
Mm.
they certainly
Mhm.
have a resume, right?
Yes, they
And
do.
I do think
Mhm.
the songs here are certainly good. What I responded to here was maybe more of the darkness that's kind of depicted underneath the chase of that dream that I really did respect. And I think as a music movie in that regard, I do think it is very good.
Yeah, I also really like this film. I didn't fully love it, and based off of your opening thoughts there, it sounds like you do like it, maybe a little bit more than me. But
Okay.
there is a lot to really like here, though. I love how melodically meditative it is. This is a
Hmm.
film that is not at all afraid to waft in these lingering shots and characters being in the moment.
Hmm.
And like John Carney's Once, that's certainly a film you can't help but think about.
Yeah.
Or I also thought of Ethan Hawke's Blaze. That came to mind for me as well.
Sure.
Like
Okay.
those
Okay.
two movies, there are more than a few moments here where the film pauses to let these characters exude their musical abilities
Hmm.
and that they are defined by it. And
Hmm.
to your point, Brendan, the music is really good.
Yeah.
I did really enjoy it quite a bit as well. There's also this fascinating wrinkle that Dandelion, the KiKi Layne character here, is a black musician trying to find her voice in a world where there aren't many others that look like her.
Yeah.
So the music here, it isn't just an outlet for Dandelion to express herself and engage her identity, but it becomes a cipher for community and connection. And when you couple that with the film's wandering sensibilities, oh man, I think
Hmm.
it is very good when it's clicking on all cylinders. Not to mention KiKi Layne's engrossing performance, and she is
Sure.
really, really good here. The problem, at least for me, is that much of the narrative here is frustratingly bogged down and tired tropes and easily predictable character beats. There
Hmm.
is a surprise at the end of the film that admittedly caught me off guard. But the majority of the film is extremely formulaic, and it doesn't really do much to hide from that either. The dialogue is at times pretty cringy as well. Maybe that's why I loved the small, quiet moments here, because it avoids that actively. So I don't really like the writing here. This is a film that wants to emphasize the music. It cares about the artist struggle. It cares about the music. When it's acting as a movie, I do think it struggles mightily. When it's just about the music and what drives these characters, there is a mesmerizing quality to this film that I did respond to.
There's a lot of things going on here from a filmmaking standpoint that maybe saves some of those writing blemishes that you're talking about, because I do agree they are here. The script is probably the weakest attribute, although I do acknowledge that reveal you're referring to is, I wouldn't say it's surprising, but I like that it's here in depicting this man, Casey, as sort of stuck in this purgatory of sorts within his dream and his life. And that is a real thing many musicians struggle with. I know many of them personally here in the Philadelphia music scene, and in many ways I'm kind of like that as well. There are moments here where Casey's plight kind of broke my heart, but it's not the writing that's doing it. It's really just more of the situation that I can relate to. So that makes me super biased when it comes to criticizing this movie, and I'm certainly willing to admit that. But I do think there are other things from a filmmaking standpoint that maybe notice those blemishes a little bit less often, whether it be in, I'm going to try and get these names right, but Lauren Gutierrez's cinematography, I think, is really fluttery in a way that I found really mesmerizing as well. The editing here by Milena Petrovic, I think, is especially really powerful. The way it's almost fragmented like memories, and almost feels like certain scenes are depicted to us out of order. And I think in those situations, there's an artfulness in how the romance is visualized, even if it's not maybe as compellingly written, if that makes sense. So I certainly don't disagree that the film, from a script writing standpoint, is not just formulaic, but a little cringy, as you very eloquently put it. But I'm able to overlook that due to some of those interesting things that Nicole Riegel is doing as a filmmaker. And this is only her second film. I haven't seen her debut film, Holler, which I heard was pretty well received as well.
Yeah, I heard it was pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah, same here. And I'm curious to check that one out, just given how much I enjoyed this one here, Dandelion. But one of the things I also love here, too, is just the sense of place and how she lets the setting really speak for itself. You're right that Dandelion herself is really this outlier in a very white biker-filled world, South Dakota. But the music that she and Casey make together is this fusion of her soulful side and his southern side, and that is a legit genre of music, country soul and southern soul, that is country music that's very much influenced by classic R&B and the southern roots of how that may have fueled it back in the day. And I like that the film, whether it be indirectly, sort of acknowledges that synergy and how certain musical movements can actually work well together, even if they are perceivably coming from very different ethnic places. And I think that almost works symbolically, even if that wasn't necessarily the intent. So there's a lot here going on artistically that I guess I was able to overlook some of those narrative blemishes, even though I don't disagree that they are here.
Yeah, and I was won over by the film in the end as well. I did enjoy the film despite those obvious marks against it. And I think what distincts this film from something like a Once or a Blaze, Sing Street, many films of this ilk that we could certainly bring up here, I feel like while those films at times can also fall traps to similar-ish tropes, I do feel like those films in execution are trying to do something interesting with those tropes.
There's more personality in those films.
Absolutely. That it's a great way to articulate it. This feels like a film that just did not care. We're going to write them in. They're going to brazenly adopt them, and who cares? And so like it's not even trying, and it's the lack of effort that frustrated me. I do not mind when a film features obvious tropes and narrative traps, but does at least attempts to do something interesting with them. This film just did not care. It just went along with it.
I don't know if I would say
However,
it didn't care, but it is definitely it isn't quite as passionately visualized as those other films
yeah.
are.
Well,
I certainly wouldn't disagree with that.
it felt, at least to me, that it just wasn't interested in trying to avoid them in any way, shape, or form. And look, I can
Which
admire
is
if the
fine,
film
yeah.
brazenly just wants to be like, look, we have to get from A to Z,
Hey, it's like,
and I
let
don't
the
really
per-
care to get clever
Yeah.
here. I
Yeah.
just want to focus on the music and the cinematography. And if that is, the goal here for Nicole Riegel, then by all means,
Sure, sure.
I can admire that, but it doesn't dissipate those those
fair.
criticisms, especially if we're comparing this to something like a Once
Yeah.
or a Blaze or something of that ilk. However, moving that aside, I do think there are still really compelling things here. You mentioned the cinematography. The visual composition of this film is quite sensational at times.
Yeah.
It is breathtaking to look at. I do love the film's meandering sensibilities. I know that's not going to work for everybody, but as we have talked about many times previously, we somewhat joked about this on the main show this last week when talking about a slasher film of all things. Or
Yeah.
even with Longlegs, this was a talking
would've-
point as well.
Who would have thought we'd be comparing Dandelion to horror movies here?
Who would have thought? But recently we had this conversation with, within the horror realm.
Yeah.
But I do love how this film lingers in these wondrous visuals, and that artistry from a filmmaking perspective, I think couples very well with what this film is in terms of the artist's conviction
Yeah.
and how that creates a polarity when it intersects with insecurity or the reality that the dream isn't as attainable as you hoped it would be. And that is absolutely at the core of this film with both Dandelion and Casey. And I do love how in both characters we see that polarity. We do understand
we do.
they have a clever creativity. They have a conviction. They love the music. And there is a prowess to their music abilities. However, with Dandelion, there's a level of insecurity that makes her emotional at times. There's a volatility to the character that is really interesting. And with Casey, there's a level of despondency to the character because he never reached the plateau that he was aiming for. And when that rubs up against certain realities, as you're talking about there, Brendan,
Yeah.
it left him at a crossroads where he had to choose. So at the beginning of this film, when we first meet him, we learn that he's been away from the scene
Yeah.
for quite some time.
I think he's in sales, he said, and that leads to even some disagreements with his former band, Brother Isley here, which is a real band, as we were looking up before we actually recorded this. They're a real group, it seems. And some of the music they play here is really good. I want to check them out. But in this fictional world here, as they're represented, it looks like their lead singer is very despondent towards Casey given his choices. He actually takes it very personally. And I like that there's varying perspectives in Casey's actions, how some could be negatively affected by him, not just financially, that they lost a member that was maybe very core and crucial to their overall sound, but just emotionally that it's almost like a betrayal to their own dream hunting, right? And that's I like that that's depicted here. Casey's a fascinating character, and I say fascinating because there's so much about him that I've seen in real life. I've seen so much of his plight in real life that it probably made me like the movie so much more than it probably deserves. But I'm willing to admit that. But there is something very truthful in not just the way he's represented here, but also in Doherty's performance, which I think is pretty good. And he's relatively unknown for what I understand. He's been in a lot of Disney Channel properties based on the resume that I've seen from him. So kind of a surprising jump to something like this, but I think he more than carries his weight, especially up against someone as great as KiKi Layne. And I think they do
Yeah.
have great chemistry here too.
Absolutely. I haven't seen much of the television work that he's done.
Hmm.
I did see The Invitation when that came out, but honestly, I don't remember too much about his role in that film.
Yeah, I missed that one.
Dandelion is really the first time I've noticed him in a real way.
Hmm.
And I do think he's really great here. I think what's fascinating about Casey is that he strikes up this relationship with Dandelion. There's an earnestness to it. And I think he sees the same polarity in her as he's feeling himself.
Yeah.
You couple that with the musicality that comes out of both of them. You eloquently articulated how they have a different sound because of who they are and where they come from, but together they're able to create a melody, a style, a type of music that
Yeah.
is spellbinding when they're able to work congruently with one another. And the music that does come out of that is really fantastic.
Yeah.
However, as the film goes, we learn that there's a little bit more to Casey than what is revealed initially. And the film kind of slowly peels away at that. Now, certainly some of it gets bogged down in some of those tropes and terrible dialogue we talked about earlier. But
Yeah.
the central idea behind it, I do really like, especially because of Doherty's performance. He does such a great job of tapping into that sincerity in the character. He has a great dynamic with Layne as well, and you fully buy their dynamic. So when the film starts to peel that back a little bit in those final sequences, and we get a reveal there's such a striking duality at play where we see Casey at his lowest, at his worst even, but there is a genuine heartbreak there that he can't accept either sides of the reality. I'll say as vaguely as I can because I don't want to give it away.
Yeah.
But there's one reality that he knows he can't escape from, or at least he hasn't admitted to himself that that will allow him to escape. But on the other token, this other reality that is now ripped away from him, it genuinely kills him. Like it genuinely destroys him emotionally. And like, I love that polarity.
One reality is very obligatory, but also littered with disappointment. The other one is very fulfilling, but also leads to abandonment. There's this tug of war he's going through, and either choice he makes, he's probably going to feel like he doesn't win. And what I do like about this film is that both our main characters, Casey and Dandelion, neither of them really get what they want. Casey does not get what he wants. Dandelion, she doesn't, with a bit of an asterisk, because it concludes in a way where maybe the thing that she wants is just she can find it in a very different way. And that's also the beauty of the music scene, is that we live in a day and age where you don't really need to be reliant on competitions or labels or radio exposure to get yourself heard, or at least build your own audience, even if that audience isn't selling out arenas. You know, there's something to be said about selling out maybe a small club that fits 75 people, but everyone is there to hear your music, as opposed to playing like, and I can relate to this. I've done this before. My band that I play in primarily, we've done small venues like that where everyone's there to hear us. But then we've also played certain events in the city, Philadelphia specifically, where there might be 1,000 people there, but only 2 people probably care to hear music. So there's a huge difference there. And I like that this film concludes for Dandelion in a way that suggests another path for her that is possible.
Yeah, and a level of acceptance that wasn't there earlier.
Yeah, there's a naivete with her in the beginning that I think is really appropriate, and why her performance, KiKi Layne specifically, is very good. And I'm with you, what you talked about earlier, that interplay between her and Casey is very fascinating, not just from a genre fusion standpoint, like I talked about earlier, but how they write songs together that lyrically represent both sides of their respective journeys, and
Mhm.
they battle each other. There's one song where they
Yeah.
actually are like literally fighting against each other. I think the song
Yeah.
is called Old Friend. Probably my favorite song on the soundtrack, if I'm being honest. And it
Mm.
almost comes off like this passive aggressive argument between the two of them.
Yeah.
And when they perform that on stage, it weirdly works, not just in the way that they look at each other and how they perform it back and forth, but like it's literally what you want out of a duet, because it's all about two
Yeah.
perspectives bringing together this full narrative.
Well, yeah, and that emotion that comes out in terms of the creation of that song is
Mhm.
because there is a creative conviction
Yeah,
with both of them, and they both also know what's at stake.
sure.
That this is their best attempt to get beyond these walls that they've created for themselves.
Mhm.
And they want to create the best music they can, because if they're ever going to break beyond this ceiling they feel like they're trapped in, this
Mhm.
is the moment. So they want to create the best music they can, and sometimes that conviction comes to a head because you have two creative minds that are very good at what they're
Mhm.
doing, and
Sure.
it is a fascinating duality in itself in terms of the conflict, in terms of the creation. But to your point, when they do play the song, it comes off elegant and ravishing. You wouldn't have known that there was any conflict in
Sure.
terms of leading to that point, which is
Mhm.
really fascinating. And to speak to what you were saying about Dandelion and the naivete in the character, I think you also make some really great points that the frustration, the catharsis that we see in the character when she's playing in these small bars and clubs. And she's at that point where, as you were talking about, many artists locally, all they have is the audience that it goes to these clubs and bars,
Yeah.
or whatever audience she can render locally based off of her own marketing,
Mhm.
as many artists do.
Yeah.
But the problem is that that's the only audience you have.
Yeah.
So if no one is paying attention to you, if your audience is limited to begin with, it's one thing if you're the National and you are playing at a stadium and there's 10,000 people, and I don't know, maybe half of them are on their phones. I mean, who cares? You're the National. You're
But
playing at
still, in that case, they're all there to see you, even if they're on
they're
their
all there
phones.
to see you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. In this case, Dandelion is at these bars and clubs. Maybe some of them are there to see her. Regardless, her audience is limited. And when a bunch of them are not paying attention, it feels like you've limited yourself to such a small space that there's just no way out, and until she
Mhm.
just combusts.
Well,
And
yeah.
I find that fascinating, like how the film represents that kind of caving in feeling that she has on stage there. The
Mhm.
execution admittedly is a little weird. It is a
Oh,
little,
it's a li
again, it's a little
it's a little
movie-ish in a
wonky.
way
It's
that
a
I
little
don't
wonky.
love.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
It's
But the idea is still interesting enough, though.
yeah, and it's a real struggle. It really is. And that's what I think is so great about her performance, KiKi Layne, and that arc, because there is a lesson to be learned for not just her, but really any local musician that maybe has those same dreams. That sometimes the best thing you can do, at least at first, is focus on the small wins. Focus on those little victories. You play a bar gig like that where no one's listening, and believe me, I've been there. You play a restaurant and people are there on their phones. You can actually hear them over your microphone as you're trying to perform.
Oh
The
yeah.
way that
Yeah.
the sound editing captures that is so uncomfortable and horrific for those who
Mhm.
have actually been in that situation. I can tell you stories of things that we've been through. I won't bore you with those details, but imagine changing your perspective a little bit, where you play those gigs maybe a few times over and over, and maybe you win over 2 or 3 new fans. Okay, let's focus on them. It's called building super fans and focusing
Yeah.
on those super fans, and then maybe that's how you build a following. So you might not have a fan base, but you at least have a small local following then.
Mhm.
And you can kind of assume that that's what Dandelion herself learns by the way that this film concludes. And I think that's a great victory for any local artist. And that's what feels great about it, knowing that you're at least capturing the hearts of certain people, even if it's not a lot of people. Quantity over quality, or quality over quantity, I should say, is what I think this is arguing. And I think that's a really fascinating notion.
Yeah, and the arc that the epiphany that event that she gets to eventually, I think that's why it is striking, because again, it comes with a level of acceptance as to what her reality is going to be, and it very much speaks to what you're talking about there, and how that comes about due to heartbreak that's a result of that duality in Casey we mentioned earlier. I do love how the film arrives there. That's the one moment of the film where it very much avoids conventionality in terms of narrative tropes and where you think these two characters might end up. I do appreciate the ending of this film. I think it ends in a really nice space. And
I agree.
Again,
The mechanics getting there a little wonky. I certainly don't disagree.
Yeah, the mechanics aren't great. But what I do love about getting from A to Z, while the points themselves, the A, B, and C plot points that drive much of this narrative, I don't love those. But the in-between spaces is genuinely really great. I do want to emphasize that, because so much of this film is quiet. It is still. It's these characters simply interacting with each other in these organic, tender ways that I do really love. Whether it's the two of them together, Dandelion and Casey, spending time, the camera lingering on them with the sun in the background, kind of infiltrating the lens. It's really fantastic stuff, visually speaking. And I love the tenderness in the performances and in that dynamic. Or it's the band, like it's the community, them hanging out together and spending time. And
just them jamming, making music at a campfire. I love that.
All of that is great. Like, when it is about the music, these characters, that community, that's where this film is at its strongest, and it is good. It's just the mechanics of A, B, and C, and D, and we arrive at E and F. Like that's where it's not great. In fact, it's actively bad at those points. But there's so much in between that is good that ultimately there's still a lot here to really like. And
what do they say? Less than the sum of its parts kind of thing. The individual parts are really strong. I think the scenes themselves are better than the final movie. But yeah, I'm still able to I was still won over by the final movie, just given the relatability here.
And to something we said earlier, the music overall is very good. I do agree. The score here, composed by the Desna brothers, fantastic. I love them in general. They're really great. My favorite song, though, of the film, and honestly, it kind of caught me off guard, because while I was enjoying the music, I don't know if on this first watch, it could change for me upon rewatches. But upon the first watch, I wasn't quite caught up with it in the same way I was once, or even Blaze, or an Inside Llewyn Davis. It didn't quite reach those heights for me until we get to this moment where, and it's somewhat of a close-up on Dotery, on Casey, and he sings this song called The Honey, and it's good. Immediately was enamored by it. Like, I was like, oh my, okay, we're cooking now.
You know what I think
we're cooking now.
I even thought about you during that moment, thinking, I feel like this is the song JD's going to respond to. And
oh my God, I loved it.
Well, yeah. I think I've noticed that you respond very heavily to songs that are built more around minor keys as opposed to major keys. And I'm speaking music jargon.
I don't know what that means, but sure.
But the beauty of that is you would know the difference if you heard it. If I played a C major scale and then I played a C minor scale, you would hear a clear difference between the two. And one, to put it more simply, one's meant to evoke more joy and happiness. The other one evokes a bit more sadness, a little bit more trepidation. And every time you tend to respond to a song, I feel like it has a bit more of that emotional complexity built into the melody and the chordal
Okay.
changes behind
Sure.
it, not just lyrically.
Yeah.
And it was in that moment,
That
just
makes
musically
sense.
speaking, I
Yeah.
was thinking, I think JD's going to respond to this.
That makes sense. Yeah. I would never in a million years be able to articulate that. I find that utterly fascinating the way you lay that out there. But that makes a lot of sense. Sure. Just knowing my personality. Yeah.
Another great song, though. That was probably my second favorite behind Old Friend, as I mentioned earlier. I also love the song that concludes the movie, River. The final performance that
also
Dandelion
good.
gives, I think, is also a really great, like soulful, jazzy number.
Yeah, it's very good. I listened to the entire soundtrack. It's not too prolonged. I think there's only like 13 tracks in total.
And some of them are small. There's a lot of like interlude or interjections of the Desner score in between songs. It almost feels more like an EP than it does an album. It's not quite as well, actually, now that I think about it, even a movie like Once only had like 4 or 5 core songs. So
that wasn't too
so it's
I listened to the whole thing twice earlier today. The Dandelion soundtrack, like it's very good. Yeah,
it's good.
And Honey, I might have listened to a couple more times even beyond that.
But I will say, while I agree with you that the soundtracks for movies like Once and even Sing Street are stronger, they're also depicting a very different style of music and a very different kind of vibe. Like they're meant to be more instantaneously memorable, where there's less of that here with Dandelion. They're a bit more about it. I mean, it's like how classic country music is. It's more about trying to create a lyrical journey as opposed to a hook, right? And I admire that, at least, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be instantaneously gratifying for those who maybe have movies like Once and Sing Street in the back of their mind. It's not quite as instantaneous as those films are.
Yeah, absolutely. The soundtracks in all those films, and even Blaze for me, I think has more memorable songs to it. But I don't, and this is where again comparison can get tricky. I simply bring that up to say I don't think this film reaches the heights of those other films. I also don't want to become a victim of the thing that I hate when it comes to comparison, because I don't want to make it sound like the soundtrack to Dandelion is lesser than it. What is here is good. It might not reach the heights of those others, but it's good. I really enjoyed it. I wouldn't have listened to it twice in a row if I didn't like it. You know what I mean? Like I'm just going to sit here and hate listen to this twice. I'm like, no.
Just like I need to do my research to know why it sucks.
Exactly. No, I'm sorry. I can't be wasted my time like that these days. No, yeah. Like
I will say,
it is good. I enjoyed it.
I think the music spoke to me even more given just my overall mindset when I saw this, because I admittedly, as a musician, I go through a bunch of different phases as far as like what kind of music I want to listen to, because I want to challenge myself to learn new things and learn new techniques. And admittedly, I'm kind of in this mode of country and soul music right now. So seeing this movie was like, oh, yeah, you like this music now? Yeah, you should see this movie. It was weirdly perfectly timed for me to see this movie right now, because I'm just listening to a lot of modern examples of this kind of music. So maybe that's another reason why I just responded to this movie a little bit more than you did. It's one of those movies, I think, like if I didn't have that, that subjective mindset blinding me, this is a 3.5 out of 5 on Letterboxd for me, but I'm kind of willing to push it to 4 just because of how much I can relate to the material. That's certainly a me thing. It's not really a reflection of the movie. It's more of a reflection of me, but sometimes the best movies are those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess as we get to final thoughts here, winding down this conversation, I'm obviously not a musical guy in the same ways that you are. However, where I did relate to this film in terms of the artist's struggle here reminded me a little bit early on of this podcast. Not that I ever had high expectations or that we'd reach a certain plateau. That was never really on my mind. However, it was something that I really wanted to do. And I started this show with my best friend, Nate, back in 2013.
Yeah.
And he found himself at the same crossroads Casey does in this film, where
Yeah, that's a good
he
point.
was involved. He really liked doing the show, but there was the reality component in terms of where our lives were heading, because
Yeah.
as we had started this show, we had both gotten engaged. I had gotten married about a year and a half into doing the show.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
wasn't too long after that. And life has a way of changing your perception when you're, kind of in those stages. So
Yeah.
he ends up walking away. And I do remember feeling at odds with that decision, because
Mm-hmm.
I really loved doing this show with him. And two, I wasn't sure what that meant for the band, so to speak. Like, I wasn't sure where
The
this was
In-Session
going
band.
to go. The In-Session band. And then my Dandelion, my sunflower, comes along, if you will, in early 2014, and there was similar harmony between Brendan and I, as we see between our two central leads here. So my sunflower ends up saving the band, and
You really
here we
do
are
like
10 years
wearing your
later.
heart on your sleeve. I love it.
Of course. So, like, just to share my personal attachment to the
Well,
the
I love
film,
you too,
like,
man.
that's what I thought about. That's how I could get my in, since I don't play music, but I could relate from that
Hey,
perspective.
art's art. Art's art.
Art is art, yeah.
Being able to relate to the music in particular maybe helps with this movie, but doesn't need to be reliant on music. It's not a music movie in the sense that it needs to be only for musicians.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's what's great
Exactly.
about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any other final thoughts on Dandelion? Is that it? Anything else?
I think that's it. We did mention their names, but I just want to emphasize once again, KiKi Layne and Thomas Doherty, I think,
Yeah,
are really
they're
great
really
here.
good.
KiKi Layne, I think she kind of falls into a similar camp as Lupita Nyong'o for me, as like, why haven't we made her a bigger star yet? I think they just have a certain presence that is so magnetic and so hypnotizing and beautiful. I want to see more of them. We loved KiKi Layne ever since we saw her in If Beale Street Could Talk. And she's been in a few things since then that I thought she was also really great in. She knows how to carry a film. She knows how to do that, and I want to see more of her. So let's make her a star. I think she's really great here.
Yeah, let's make her a star. I completely agree. Every time she's on screen, utterly magnetic. Demands the screen, demands your attention.
Yeah.
I do love that about her in this film. She really is terrific. And I guess for some final thoughts, in spoilers, I just want to evoke a little bit of spoilers here, because we talked in generalities, we danced around it earlier, but just to evoke a moment of performance, but the context of it is Casey's decision. So what we find out at the end of the film is that while earlier he had told Dandelion that he's not really with his wife, they're separated, he doesn't know what that's going to be. But at the end of the film, while they're supposed to be preparing for this performance they're going to give, she finds out that he's at this hotel with his wife, and it turns out their daughter.
Yeah.
So he's spending time with his family, and Dandelion goes over there to confront him. She finds this out, and it doesn't appear to be that there's any conflict between him and his wife. Everything that she had learned about, oh, well, it's up in the air, I don't know, he was not truthful about that, seemingly.
Yeah.
And I think what we find out in the aftermath of it, because they separate, Dandelion leaves, she goes her separate ways, but there's an incredible moment where we go back to Casey, and he is undone by getting caught. And it to me, it felt like it came from an authentic place, not a I got caught.
No,
But
it was
I-
more of a
I
reminder of
genuinely-
that purgatory he's stuck in
Exactly.
between. And I love how that's the end of his character in the movie. That is
Yes.
how his arc
The
is left
last
dangling.
moment we get with him.
Yeah,
Yes.
like there's an
Fantastic
arc
stuff.
with Casey, but it's an incomplete one, and I love that it's left dangling like that. It
I
is
completely
devastating.
agree. Absolutely. I absolutely agree with you 100%. Like, I love that ambiguity. And that's where Dodory's performance is really great, because
Yeah.
it's tricky because when we find out that he's been leading her on or lying to her to some degree, there's a level of you that wants to be angry with him, as Dandelion is. She's obviously angry and disappointed. But that moment that Dandelion never sees. So from her perspective, it might be a little bit more black and white. But we understand, as the audience, we understand that for Casey, it's not that simple. Like, he is heartbroken in a genuine, sincere way. Like, he loved that relationship. He loved Dandelion. But because of that duality, this obligatory feeling of responsibility he has, at least towards his daughter, maybe his wife too, who knows? It's all kind of left up in the air. But he was heartbroken over what happened between him and Daniel. And like, I love how that also leads to Dandelion's reaction as well. Like, when she finds out the truth, like, there's equally a moment where we come to her and she is cathartic about it. And KiKi Layne's performance there is stunning. Both of them, honestly, Layne and Doherty.
They're
Just
great.
Stunning stuff.
They're great. They carry this film a lot.
Yeah. The ending for all of the issues of this film, the
third act
ending
is great.
Absolutely sticks the landing. It is so good.
The third. It's one of the better third acts I've seen this year. And if the rest of the movie was as congealed as that was, then I think we're looking at one of the better films of the year in totality. And admittedly, because of how much I could relate to, it is one of my favorite films of the year, even though I acknowledge it isn't one of the best. You know, there are blemishes here.
Fair.
And I also have to be clear, when I say I can relate to this story, I'm referring to the individual musical plights that these characters go through. Because for those of you listening, if you can hear by my voice, or if you're watching on YouTube, you could see I am not a black woman, so I can't relate to the specificity of Dandelion and her art. And how she finds herself as this outlier in this very white biker world in South Dakota. And I love, as you pointed in earlier in this conversation, I love how she is this outlier, and the film very deliberately depicts that. And there is a lot you could say symbolically and socially just about that very thing. So I can't relate to that, but I can relate to the type of performances that she has given and how people just don't want to listen to you. Those things there, that's what I want to focus on, just to make that clear in case I don't get accused of anything else.
Yeah, exactly. Well said. Well said. I don't have too much to add to that. That distinction certainly should be
important. It's important.
Yes.
Yeah.
With all of that said, if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, please leave a comment below. If you're watching on YouTube, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, reach out to us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd. You can email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com. As we get out of here, just a reminder that we have a review up for... What did we do earlier this week?
Long Legs, of
course. It was Long Legs. I didn't forget. I was testing Brendan. That's what happened there.
I guess the legs are not long with that one anymore.
Yeah, I had forgotten the film.
As we talked about in that review, it didn't have a long leg to stand on.
Absolutely. So yeah, we talked about Long Legs. Episode 594 is available as well, so you can go and check that out, where we talk about some movies that we've caught up with in recent weeks and months that we haven't had much of a chance to talk about quite yet. So you can check all of that out. We'll have a review for Twisters coming up soon as well. So yeah, a lot happening. Be on the lookout for all of that. Subscribe to the channel or to the podcast, however you join us. We really do appreciate it.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts, Brendan, before we get out of here?
Oh, this movie just maybe cannot wait for my wife and I to move into our new house coming soon, because then I can actually decorate my background with my bass guitars again and keep the music thing going. I can't wait to do that again. I miss it.
Yep.
I miss it
soon
so
enough.
much. Soon.
Coming up, right?
Soon. Yeah, we as we're recording this, we close in about just under 2 weeks, actually.
There you go. All right. Very exciting.
Yeah, still a lot to do as we close. I mean, that's just the closing date. There's still, like, we still have to actually schedule things with the movers. We have to You get a proper cleaning done. I booked with Stanley Steamer. They're not a plug for this show or anything like that, but we've got to do all those things as well. So yeah, a lot to do. Feel like an adult.
Yeah, I know. Adulting can be difficult.
I don't like it. I just want to play music for the rest of my life.
I know. I hear you.
Yeah.
As a final thought, real quick, and this is a little bit weird because Dandelion doesn't feel like it is particularly egregious, but I do struggle, honestly, to find myself recommending this film because
That's fair.
there are the blemishes of it for sure, and that's one thing. But also, and I know we emphasized this a couple of times, but this film meanders. It is a wandering movie that is quiet and still, which I love. For me, I eat that stuff up all day.
Yeah.
But there's so much of that here that I just don't know how anyone would respond to that.
Well,
I could see a lot of people feeling bored by this film.
I think general moviegoers, maybe. But I also think about those that also maybe love movies like Once and Sing Street, especially Sing Street. There are other people in my life who are not part of our critic circle that really love Sing Street. And if I recommend this movie and they go in thinking that, they're going to be disappointed.
Yeah, exactly.
Because this is going to feel very mild compared to.
Yeah, it does not
that.
have that kind of energy at all.
It does not, no. And I think you make a great point that it is admittedly a hard movie to recommend, but I will say, for those who might be in a similar case as I am, and maybe you've partaken in your local music scene in some way, I absolutely would recommend it. Because I think what this film does very effectively, maybe even a little bit more so than some of those other counterparts we mentioned, is depicting that struggle and the relatability of that struggle. I think there's maybe a little bit more realism here than some of those other films as far as that particular thing is concerned.
Sure.
And I guess for that audience, I would recommend it for sure.
Absolutely. For that particular audience, I do agree. I guess there's just a little bit of a specificity to that there is.
You're not
generally
wrong.
speaking,
Yeah.
I guess you just have to know who you're talking to.
It's a small percentage of the totality. Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah. You just need to know who you're talking to, and if they fit that mold that Brendan is talking about, then sure, go ahead and throw this out there as something that they can watch and will likely enjoy or relate with that struggle in some way, shape, or form. But yeah, just generally across the board, it's like, I don't know. It's weird because, again, it's not egregious, but there's enough going on here that it's like, I don't know.
It's calm. It's calming, and to some, it's going to be too calming.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, with all of that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. KiKi Layne, let's make her star.
And Thomas Doherty. Both stars.